Well, thank you all very much for coming out today to the Anthracite Heritage Museum. This is Charter Day, the day that the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission celebrates the signing of the Pennsylvania Charter by William Penn. All of our PHMC sites are open across the Commonwealth, and we're glad you chose to come out here today. We're fortunate. Well, we're unfortunate back in January when this labor history program that Bob Wolensky put together was scheduled. The weather was, as you all know, not very nice. But today we've got a spectacular day, and really glad you all came out. Real quick, the museum's going to be open until 5 today. If you haven't been through in a while, the Scott Herring exhibit, which has been up for a year and a half now, we are moving it around a little bit to put it into a smaller space as we get ready for 2 new exhibits. Seeing Double will be the next exhibit in April coming. That's Richard Healy, who is a British historian that's worked quite a bit in the anthracite region and really in Pennsylvania industry. And that's an exhibit on stereo views, part of his personal collection. And that should be opening up later in April. And then we've got another exhibit on the United Mine Workers by an artist out of Boston coming up, hopefully in June or July. So that should be a pretty interesting exhibit as well. So keep an eye on our website for those dates. We've got some refreshments coming. I'm Jeff Kiefer, who just stuck his head out. He's the president of the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Iron Furnaces Associates. Jeff brought some hoagies, and then Kathleen Donahue, who is also on the board of the Associates, has some other refreshments coming. So otherwise, help yourself to some waters that are back there. So anyway, I hope you enjoy your stay, and then I'm going to turn it over now to Bob Wolensky to start the program. And real quick, Suzanne, can you mute your microphone?
I thought I did. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, Bob.
Well, okay, Bodie, we all set?
We're good.
Thank you very much, Bodie, and thanks to the museum for hosting us on this Commonwealth Day. We looked for another day after the cancellation in January, and this was a good day, and I think it's going to work out very well. I'm glad to see the weather is much improved. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for coming to discuss an important topic. The anthracite region has been all about labor history. It's been all about economic history. It's been all about social history, ethnic history, immigration history, but it's also been let's not forget environmental history, but it's also been very much about labor history. Going back to the early 1900s and the strikes of 00 and 02, we have been a hotbed of labor activism. So we're glad to do this, and we have great speakers who are going to talk about a lot of the early first third of the 20th century, when it was mainly the coal miners involved in labor activism. After that, it was much more the garment workers and other unions. Well, we have 4 speakers today, including myself. We have Lucia Daley. We have Tom Mackaman. We have Bob Schmidt, and of course, myself. We're going to each take 20 minutes or so, talk about the different aspects of the region's history. We'll introduce them by topic, and then we'll save questions for the very end, if that's okay with you all. Okay, well, we are going to we're going to begin with Lucia Daley from Clark Summit, who's going to talk to us about Monsignor John J. Curran, the anthracite's labor priest, who's very famous in this neck of the woods. Lucia's writing a biographical sketch of Monsignor Curran. She's a writer, teacher, performer, and Pennsylvania Council of the Arts roster artist. She spent time in Tucson, Arizona, studying native culture and music. She returned to northeastern PA to study modern foreign languages at the University of Scranton. She got a degree in English literature, awarded the university's Joseph X. Bruner Prize for excellence in foreign languages. She received grants from the Pennsylvania Council of Arts and the Lackawanna County Arts and Culture Program for her original work. She has performed with various artists from folk icon Pete Seeger to noticed jazz and classical musicians Doug Smith and Ron Stabinsky. A great-granddaughter of immigrant coal miners who settled in the area in the 19th century, her first novel, Mine Seed, which is probably available in the museum's bookstore, set in northern Anthracite, recounts the significant and sometimes violent battle anthracite miners waged to achieve fair pay and safe working conditions. Though fictionalized, Mine Seed is based entirely on oral and recorded history. In addition to Mine Seed and a work on James Joyce's Ulysses, she has another historical novel, Wounded Island, set in World War I. A volume of her poetry is due to be published. Her articles and poems have appeared in various papers, magazines, and anthologies. She lives in Clark Summit with her husband, Jim, and her family lives nearby. Welcome, Lucia, and thank you for being here and educating us about Monsignor Curran. Take it away.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming on this almost spring day. It's so good to see you here. I'm just going to dive right in because there's a lot to say about Father Curran and the labor history. And I don't want to take up too much time because we have great speakers following. So
Lucia, excuse me, the camera is aimed at your shoes. There we go. There we go.
Sorry, I'm not techie. Sorry about that, everyone. My shoes aren't that interesting, no matter what you can say about them. They've served me, though. So Father John Curran, labor priest. We're going to dive right in. It's a very interesting history, and he was an interesting man. When Father John Curran died in 1936 at age 77, he was widely praised as a man of God, and perhaps more to the point, a man of action, working on behalf of poor and struggling workers in the anthracite coal fields and beyond. He was born in 1859 to immigrant Irish parents, John and Ellen McKeon Curran, in Hawley, Pennsylvania. His father, John Sr., had emigrated from Ireland in 1847, known in Ireland as Black 47, the height of the Great Famine. His mother had arrived in the United States in 1848, a young girl. His parents were married in Hawley and had 12 children. What Father Curran's parents had experienced and witnessed in Ireland surely made a deep mark on him. The Irish had been forced to subsist on potatoes, as they had to give their other crops as rent to mainly absentee Irish landlords. When the potato crops failed, Ireland was decimated in a few years. Okay.
Yeah, they're saying you can't see you on the screen. There's the camera. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. The mic's over here. I'm trying to. Okay. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we're at the Irish famine. So the crops had failed, the potato crops specifically. So the Irish were decimated. In just a few years, 1 million Irish starved and another immigrated. It lasted from 1845 to 1852, and the population of Ireland before the famine was about 8.5 million, and by 1901 it was half, 4.4 million or so. In truth, there had been no famine. There were plenty of crops and livestock produced, often exported during the famine, but claimed by absentee English landlords who did nothing to alleviate the suffering and death. When Father Curran was 7, his family moved to Avoca, settling near the hillside breaker. According to their obituaries, his parents were pioneer residents in Avoca, and when his mother died in 1909, she was praised in the press as a woman, quote, held in the highest esteem by all who knew her. Her cheery disposition and good management enabled her to erect a comfortable home and bring up her family in a praiseworthy manner. The hospitality of her home was extended to her many friends, particularly to newcomers who crossed the water to make their home in America, unquote. And when John Curran Sr. died at the age of 90 in 1917, Father Curran's father, he was hailed as, quote, one of Luzerne County's most prominent citizens and known throughout the valley, unquote. Growing up in the Gilded Age of America, when robber barons of industry refused to acknowledge the plight of the varied laborers they depended on, Father Curran knew firsthand the danger and misery of coal mining. At age 8, he had begun to work as a slate picker, then mule driver for the Pennsylvania Coal Company. His wages were needed to supplement the family income, as his father's wages from the mines were not sufficient. In 1869, at 10 years old, he joined a strike of Pittston miners who were facing a reduction in wages. He attended night school. When his younger siblings were old enough to work, he was able to leave the mines at 16 and attend a public school for 2 years, full-time, after which he entered Wyoming Seminary in Kingston, a good school under the jurisdiction of the Wyoming Conference of the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is still in existence, and still a good school. He graduated from there with high honors in English and mathematics. He further studied at St. Vincent's College in Latrobe, PA, and then he studied for 5 years for the priesthood at the Grand Seminary in Montreal. He was ordained a priest by Bishop William O'Hara in Scranton in 1877 and was first assigned to St. Rose of Lima Parish in Carbondale. And he was a founder of Holy Savior Church in Wilkes-Barre and later elevated to a Monsignor, a title he never used. His last assignment was at St. Mary's Church in Wilkes-Barre. Father Curran ministered to the many Irish, Slav, and Italian immigrants who had settled in the coal region. Historian Catherine Klein wrote, quote, Father Curran interpreted his pastoral responsibility as extending beyond primarily religious concerns, for he believed that the church could do much to remedy the deficiencies in life in a mining community. He placed special emphasis, for example, on providing the best in architecture and music in his church, not only to give greater glory to God, but to supply an element of beauty to lives of those who spent so much time in the black and grimy coal mine. He was one of the most energetic leaders in the various efforts to provide badly needed recreational facilities in Wilkes-Barre. Yet, important as these problems were, it was the labor question which overshadowed all the others in the coal fields, and it was this priest's participation in the labor movement which gave him his special importance, unquote. As industry developed, the Catholic hierarchy in Rome was not in the main sympathetic to the labor movement. From the inception of mining in the anthracite fields, several unions had been crushed by owners backed up by state and federal troops and private police, as was usual throughout the United States. Propaganda crusades were also waged, led by men like Franklin Gowen, president of the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, against alleged Molly Maguires, which culminated in the execution of 21 Irish Union men and civic leaders in Schuylkill County in the 1870s. The testimony convicting them was all based on a single Pinkerton agent, John McParland's activities as spy and agitator. McParland's tactics were later exposed by famed lawyer Clarence Darrow in Idaho in 1907 in a trial which implicated Western miners in similar crimes. The jury there returned a not guilty verdict. McParland was disgraced in court and faded into ignominy. John Kehoe, the alleged Molly Maguire leader, had seen his wife's relatives murdered when unknown assailants broke into their home during the night and shot Kehoe's pregnant sister-in-law and her brother at point-blank range and pistol-whipped their mother. The assailants were never caught, but some evidence points to the involvement of Gowan and other owners. It is known as the Wiggins Patch Massacre. John Kehoe was granted a posthumous full pardon by Governor Milton Shapp in 1979 after the state of Pennsylvania re-examined the case and found his trial a, quote, miscarriage of justice, unquote. Governor Shapp said the alleged Mollies were, quote, martyrs to labor, unquote. And see the recent scholarship of Anne Flaherty in her book, The Passion of John Kehoe, which I think is for sale at the bookstore now on this topic in this section of history. So due to such violence and repression, it was very difficult to advance conditions of working people, as you can imagine. And attempts to organize and unionize were met with force, and strikers were often, quote unquote, shot back to work. Father Curran was very familiar with the owners' tactics used to quash working people, and he steadfastly supported the miners in their endeavors to unionize and redress their grievances peacefully. Several times northeastern Pennsylvania was under martial law during strikes, and union leaders and workers targeted and killed, as in the 1870s. In 1897, the tragic Latimer Massacre occurred when 86 deputies, along with coal company police and around 150 men in all, armed with rifles and pistols, were ordered to shoot at striking unarmed miners. Several men immediately fell dead. The remaining miners turned to run away, but the firing continued for another 2 minutes. Over 12 fleeing workers were shot in the back, and 19 miners died that day, and more from wounds later. In 1891, Pope Leo XIII, not this pope, but in 1891, Pope Leo published his encyclical was published, Rerum Novarum, and it announced that the church now officially embraced trade unions and social legislation to deal with the conditions of poverty and hardship in the working classes brought on by the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. The new official position of the church would buttress Father Curran's own position on labor, but he was already practicing the newly announced social teachings of the church. Prior to 1890, as noted before, several labor unions had come and gone in Pennsylvania coal fields, destroyed by coal owners with the power of the state behind them. But in 1890, the United Mine Workers of America was formed, with John Mitchell becoming its president in 1898. At that time, the conditions of workers in the anthracite fields was described by Pennsylvania Governor Gifford Pinchot as a swamp of misery. In 1901, it was tabulated that the absolute minimum wage to live on was $585 per year, yet the annual wage for a miner that year was $360. As also mentioned before, children had to work to augment family income. Slate pickers were paid 39 cents a day. That would be children working mostly as slate pickers. Besides, low pay conditions in the mines were extremely dangerous, yet the owners did very little through the years to alleviate any of this. By 1900, J.P. Morgan and a few railroads had acquired 95% of anthracite mines, which are located solely in an area of about 500 square miles in northeastern Pennsylvania. A later United Mine Worker president, John L. Lewis, said, quote, "The big businessmen justified business piracy. They forced acquisition of everything that they desired without regard to the public right or will. They pillaged whatever was necessary in the name of economic progress, while the people sat still and gasped, powerless to resist. It was a formidable combine of brains and capital that John Mitchell planned to tackle to free the oppressed mine workers in their employ," unquote. Father Curran was one of Mitchell's most important supporters. Mitchell had said, quote, "The coal you dig isn't Slavish or Polish or Irish coal, it's just coal," unquote. And that phrase became the rallying slogan for the 1900 strike, as well as for the famous 1902 anthracite coal strike, which won better working conditions and shorter work days and wage hikes. Under Mitchell, the United Mine Workers succeeded in bringing the fact home to miners that they shared the same concerns and should work together to improve conditions and not play into the divisive tactics of the owners. In 1900, the United Mine Workers had called a strike for better pay and working conditions. Because it was an election year, the owners agreed to terms. Subsequently, the owners refused, however, to deliver on their agreement. So in 1902, anthracite miners voted to strike again against the wishes of John Mitchell, the union president. The anthracite coal strike of 1902 is considered a turning point in American labor struggles. And Father Curran, a fearless proponent of unions throughout his lifetime, was essential to the success of the strike, which labor leader Samuel Gompers called, quote, the most important single incident in the labor movement of the United States, unquote. That is, it was the first time in United States history a union was given the right of collective bargaining and not annihilated by overwhelming force. Both sides recognized the issue at stake, collective bargaining. Neither side would back down, so the strike lasted 5 months with great loss and hardship, and to the alarm of President Teddy Roosevelt. It threatened to shut down the winter fuel supplies to major cities and pushed the government to adopt a position as neutral arbitrator to settle the conflict. And remember, coal at that time was the main heating fuel in the country and for the industrial purposes as well. So it was going to be a coal famine, I guess you would say. Father Curran had also been opposed to the strike, fearing it would not end well, but once the strike was called, he worked tirelessly to support the strikers. He said, quote, they must stand united, 150,000 men and boys, as one defiant individual, unquote. And he worked with the union and the owners to try and reach an agreement. He exhorted the workers to strike, the strikers to keep the peace, and he refuted the exaggerated claims, often repeated in the press, of frenzied mobs and riots in the coal fields. He pointed out that strikebreakers were the ones committing the violence. Because he was highly respected, his words had a calming effect, and public opinion began to turn against the owners, especially after the nationwide publication of the infamous Bear Letter. It is thought that Father Curran was the source of the leak of the Bear Letter, which had been written to a photographer in Wilkes-Barre who had photographed it and given it to Father Curran. In it, George Bear, president of the Pennsylvania and Reading Railroad and spokesman for the owners, declared, quote, the rights and interests of the laboring man will be protected and cared for, not by the labor agitators, but by Christian men to whom God in his infinite wisdom has given the control of the property interests in this country, unquote. The letter was denounced across the country as a revelation that the owners held a belief in their divine right of ownership and extraction of wealth from a permanent underclass. Father Curran conferred with J.P. Morgan and became an intermediary between President Roosevelt and John Mitchell. The 1902 strike dragged on till October with winter threatening and Morgan insisting there would be no agreement with the union. Roosevelt threatened to take over the mines and operate them with federal troops if the owners did not agree to negotiate. Morgan accepted arbitration, and a commission was appointed by Roosevelt to look into the miners' claims and address the problems in the coal industry. Father Curran's visits to the White House are not recorded, but Theodore Roosevelt wrote that Curran was the man who, quote, helped him the most, unquote, from the coal fields. Their friendship deepened and continued. In a letter to Curran in 1916, Roosevelt wrote, Dear Father Curran, no man ever had a stauncher friend than you have been to me, my dear fellow. When I get back from the South, do come and see me, unquote. Roosevelt was a frequent visitor to Father Curran at Holy Savior Rectory in Wilkes-Barre. As time went on, Father Curran had a positive view of the labor situation in the coal fields, despite continued strikes, scattered violence, and infiltration of some coal companies by the mafia. See Bob Wolensky's work, Anthracite Labor Wars. And Bob and Tom Mackaman, who you're going to hear in a few minutes, they'll talk about their book that talks about the insurgent union. It's very interesting history, and it's a continuation of this whole that I'm speaking of now. The standard of living had risen for American workers in Father Curran's lifetime. due in large part to collective bargaining and peaceful strikes. The 1930s Depression saw Father Curran advocate for the policies of the New Deal. Father Curran increasingly saw the United Mine Workers Union as problematic. Its policies were unresponsive to the needs of the miners in the anthracite fields. Though he believed in the unity of workers to achieve progress, he stood behind a breakaway union, the United Anthracite Miners of Pennsylvania, founded in 1933 and headed by Rinaldo Capellini and Thomas J. Maloney. The United Anthracite Miners Union did not last long. It was defeated by discriminatory practices and lack of official support. Though Father Curran had traveled to Washington several times on its behalf, by 1935, the union was defunct. Sadly, Father Curran's work as a tireless advocate for the poor, for workers and unions led to his tragic death. On April 10th, Good Friday, 1936, a suspicious fire engulfed St. Mary's Rectory where he lived. That same day, a cigar box bomb sent by mail killed his friend and leader of the breakaway UAMP Union, Thomas J. Maloney, age 44, along with his 4-year-old son, Thomas Jr., and severely injuring his daughter. Also killed in the attack was the caretaker of Father Curran's parish cemetery, Michael Gallagher, when he opened a mail bomb. Father Curran himself had a heart attack at the time from which he never recovered. He died 6 months later. An article announcing his death in the New York Times called this tireless negotiator and man of peace militant, an adjective that only can describe a spiritual quality in him. The article stated, quote, "The very Reverend Monsignor John J. Curran, militant Catholic priest, nationally known friend of labor, died this morning," unquote. And it eulogizes him as, quote, "a civic leader, a union peacemaker. He turned out whimsical verse. He was a minister, a temperance leader, a founder of a college and several churches. He was widely known for his liberal views and was reputed to have as many friends among Protestants and Jews as among Catholic clergy and laymen. To all, he was a good neighbor. Honors were heaped upon him by a grateful community. He gave beyond his means, so that he died penniless, one of the poor he championed throughout his career." And I'd just like to add a little footnote here for the present so that we realize this work is ongoing, and to thank the people that came before us and honor their memory. Let's carry it forward. I just got these statistics this week, and I'm calling it the new age, Gilded Age of robber barons. In the last year in our country, the 100 richest people have become richer by $1.5 trillion. Elon Musk owns more wealth than the bottom 53% of Americans. The top 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 93% of Americans. CEOs now make 350 times more than their workers. 60% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Trillions have been cut from Medicaid and affordable health care. Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and 25 of the wealthiest Americans now pay effectively 3% in tax rates due to their tax privileges. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucia. A well-researched and well-delivered presentation. What you're describing is Curran's battle really against the remnants of the Gilded Age, the age of the robber barons. And the early 20th century was the workers' attempt, the working classes' attempt, to combat that, to get a piece of the pie. But in this country, the revolutionary spirit was never as strong as the reform spirit. So Curran was fundamentally a reformer, not a revolutionary, as was his Catholic Pope hero, Leo XIII. So well done, Lucia. And we are in a new Gilded Age, that's for sure. We'll see what labor does to confront the current Gilded Age. Someone said we've done it before and we can do it again. Well, it's not going to be easy as it wasn't easy last time. It took a new deal. It took a Great Depression and a new deal. That's the new deal. We're here talking about the old deal. The old deal, which early on in the 20th century and the late 19th century, we had to deal with, we had to confront, I should say, and it took the New Deal of the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt and his colleagues to change the course of the country, to tame Wall Street, and to redistribute income. And the middle class is eventually born out of that, and World War II. Remember, we had no middle class to speak of in 1940. Almost in 1950, we had no real middle class in the United States. We had a big working class. But we watching this today and we speaking today, we are the first generation. You may have heard me say this. First generation, many of us in American history, to be born and raised entirely in the middle class. The first generation. Now, there were individuals who could say that in 1890, but millions, we're talking millions. So thanks again, Lucia.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
Very good. Hang on to your questions, everybody. Our next speaker is Professor Tom Mackaman. Tom is a native of the Iron Range of northern Minnesota. He earned a doctorate in history from the University of Illinois at Champaign. And we're fortunate that he's currently John H.A. Whitman Distinguished Service Professor and chair of the Department of History at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, of course. He is the author of New Immigrants and the Radicalization of American Labor, 1914 to 1924, published by McFarland Publishers. And he also co-edited the New York Times 1619 Project. The title of the book is The New York Times 1619 Project and the Racialist Falsification of History, published by Mering Books in 2001. Tom is currently president of the American Historical Foundation. He's going to talk to us today, well, about a familiar topic that we have been this period of history we're now looking at. So thank you very much, Tom. Do we have Tom?
Yeah, I'm right here. I'm just pulling up the slides, Bob.
Oh, okay.
And while Bodie does that, thanks for having me, and thank you for the wonderful presentation, Lucia. And I quite agree with the sentiments that you closed with. That's kind of back to the future these days, it seems. And just on the topic that I'm presenting, Bob is really Bob has brought me on to this work, and I'm the second author and the second researcher for what you're about to see. And I hope that my paper can set the stage for what Bob will be talking to you about. We're dealing with a problem. When historians talk about a problem, they just mean a question in history. And the question is why it was for decades in the beginning of the last century, the first several decades, there was a constant labor insurgency. It took on different forms, but it never really stopped.
Excuse me, Tom.
Yeah.
Would you move the camera, raise it so we can see your face?
Okay.
There you go. Very good.
Yeah.
That's good.
I just bent it down. Okay.
Perfect.
So anyway, and my contribution to that today is to talk about where the industrial workers of the world came from, which is a very radical trade union movement, especially strong among the Italian immigrants here. that emerged in the late 19 teens, the origins of that. Okay. So we're looking at what appears to be a paradox. On one hand, a century ago, the anthracite, actually now I just can't see my own slides, so I wouldn't know. I can manage. Are the arrows going to work?
You're sharing. Maybe we need to go back to.
Yeah, if we can pull up the slides, that way I'll be able to advance them. You go to a lot of these talks, there's always some struggle with the technology. Sense of humor.
All right, I think you should be good.
Let's see if I can. Yep. Okay. Actually, it's not moving. It's stuck on the title page for whatever reason. Let's go to presentation mode here, and that should do it. Let's try this thing. Why is my presentation? There we go. Maybe. Ha. Let me try to save it.
It is saved.
Oh, I was going to put it on the desktop.
It is.
Okay.
That's our plan.
Okay. 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 Let's see if this is going to do it now. No. I don't know what to make of that. Bob, you weren't able to see the slides moving, were you?
No, but I saw the title slide.
Okay, yeah, we're stuck on.
Very good.
We have share screen. Okay. You're still seeing our screen?
Yeah. I see me and I see you guys and I see Sally and everybody else is blanked out.
Okay, do you see the PowerPoint now?
I only see you guys.
Okay, as long as we can play the PowerPoint, I guess that's what we'll have to.
I guess it's not.
If you click on window, does it change it?
So you're up here.
Okay, that looks better. Let's see if
Bob, do you see anything?
No. But go ahead and we'll listen to Tom.
Yeah, let me just give it one more shot. Oops. All right.
There it is. There it is.
Okay.
Title slide.
But I don't know if we're going to be able to listen.
What do you see now?
Title slide.
Okay. Okay. Whoa. Good
There we
job,
go.
Bodie.
There we go.
Okay. Back to it. Sorry. So the paradox. We have a period of dramatic concentration with the bulk of production falling under the control of J.P. Morgan, while the major trade union, the United Mine Workers, effectively organized the heavily immigrant workforce. On the other hand, the actual management of the coal mines became decentralized through a system of subcontracting. This subcontracting system depended upon highly exploited mobile and socially marginalized immigrant workforce, a workforce provided by Eastern and Southern European immigrants during the peak period of immigration in American history, more than today, despite what some politicians say. The paper argues that the concentration of the industry by capital and organized labor did not actually rationalize either its management or labor practices. Instead, the industry was characterized by corruption and chaos, which contributed to the suffering of the largely immigrant workforce. The UMW, while it accepted an almost official status from the corporations and the government, found itself engaged in a constant struggle to rein in strike activity, as well as the appeal to immigrant workers of more radical forms of organization, leading to the formation of the Industrial Workers of the World, or IWW. Some background is first in order. Anthracite coal, as I'm sure everybody here knows, also called hard coal, is a heavily metamorphosized coal that boasts an extremely high carbon content, typically 90%. Once the difficulties in igniting and containing the intense heat of this energy source were resolved, anthracite proved to be the catalyst of the early American Industrial Revolution, crucial for the development of the iron and steel industry in the 19th century, the story of which I'm sure you know again, and necessary for home and business heating in New York City and Philadelphia, which had, by the way, already in the first part of the 19th century largely burnt through their forests. Later in the 19th century, the process of coking soft or bituminous coal led to anthracite's loss of much of the industrial market. But for the first part of the last century, anthracite remained a crucial and preferred source of energy for heat transportation, owing to its purity and cleanliness in burning, as we know from the advertising featuring Phoebe Snow. While the United States boasts a superabundance of bituminous coal, which has a lower carbon content and therefore burns less effectively and pollutes more, it has only one substantial area of anthracite production, our own. And this lays tantalizingly close to the major East Coast population centers, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. The problem, as you can see from this topographical map, is the difficult geology separating coal from market. This was overcome first by the construction of a canal system linking and in some cases shadowing the major rivers, the Susquehanna, the Delaware, the Lehigh, the Schuylkill, and even the Hudson, and later through the arrival of the railroads. This was not a simple feat. Involved was a major mobilization of engineering, labor, and from the standpoint of our interests here, capital investment. For because the canals and then the railroads provided the only access of coal to the major East Coast markets, it was through control of transportation that gradually the anthracite industry as a whole became monopolized. And this is really our starting point. In key respects, the anthracite industry followed the trends of heavy capitalization and concentration, as well as working class protest, typical of numerous industries in the 19th century. Here's that map of some of the transportation. And as Lucia mentioned, by the early 20th century, a handful of J.P. Morgan-owned railroads ruled the coal companies within hard coal's three fields, the northern, the middle, and the southern, in 1900, controlling virtually all, or the great majority of anthracite production. When the coal shipments contracted with the independent lines are added, the Morgan firms, or the so-called line companies, commanded about 90%. I think Lucia gave you that statistic too. They not only dominated the mineral reserves, but transported approximately 60% of the product in 1901 and 77% in 1913. Now, to this point, the story of anthracite is familiar to broader trends in the economy of the progressive era. It is the story of the triumph of finance over industry, monopoly over free but cutthroat competition that resolved the deflationary crisis of the late 19th century. Morgan's formation of U.S. Steel out of Andrew Carnegie's empire and its lesser competitors is a much more famous example of this. Yet, as opposed to the example in steel, Morgan's consolidation failed to rein in the chaos of anthracite. Many small independent operations survived, and deflationary oversupply remained a constant problem. Moreover, even within the Morgan-controlled firms, various forms of labor subcontracting endured, and the industry's demise in the 1950s provided a constant impetus for both labor conflict and corruption. To a considerable degree and somewhat counterintuitively, the subcontracting system arose partly from miners' own control over production. Coal mining resisted the mechanization and managerial control, so-called Taylorization, spreading through other industries in the period. As late as 1925, economist Carter Goodrich noted the miners' freedom rooted in the isolation of underground work and the tradition of skilled craftsmanship. Foremen seldom entered the chambers or directed the work. Miners, certified as practical in Pennsylvania, regarded themselves as artisans entitled to independence. This autonomy, inherited from British mining culture, led Priscilla Long, a historian, to observe that even in large mines, they consisted of a series of underground shops, essentially. Two features of the labor force here are crucial. First were the origins of subcontracting. The contract miner hired, paid, and dismissed his own laborers, a little bit like a boss. 19th century miners saw themselves not as wage workers, but as independent producers who owned their own tools and sold coal as a finished product. Their autonomy extended to setting their own hours and refusing menial work such as hauling or loading, which they assigned to laborers who they paid from their own earnings. These laborers, who toiled longer hours for less pay, sometimes resented their practical miner superiors. In effect, the miner already functioned as a subcontractor, long before management formalized this arrangement into the system of subcontracting that emerged later in the 19th century. The second element was that from the beginning, the occupational differentiation between the practical miner and mine laborer coincided with and reinforced ethnic divisions in the workforce. In the 19th century, Welsh, English, and Scottish coal miners, often with experience in the old country, dominated the miner positions, while the newcomer Irish formed the mine labor force. This occupational division helped to reify a religious distinction, as the Irish were predominantly Catholic. This in turn fed into anti-immigrant know-nothing politics in Pennsylvania in the 1850s. But by the turn of the century, the practical miners included the Irish as well as the British, and the mass of the mine labor force were what were then called new immigrants, comprised heavily of Eastern and Southern Europeans. In the Anthracite region, this immigrant labor force included Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Slovaks, Ukrainians, Russians, Ruthenians, and Hungarians. The list goes on. The various Slavic groups, for example, constitute only 2% of the population in 1880, but almost half, 46% by 1900. As in the other great arenas of American industry, these new immigrants were consigned to the bottom rungs of the industry workforce. Moreover, the growth of subcontracting within the mines eroded the distinguishing social feature of the old craft tradition of coal mining. Beginning in the 1890s, to enhance their competitive position and at the same time bring greater discipline to the labor force, the coal operators began to foster their own version of the subcontracting system. The plan involved the companies putting out individual contractual agreements to entrepreneurial miners, granting them the right to remove coal in designated veins. Whereas the occupation of practical coal miner or contract miner had in the 19th century offered an avenue of social mobility for the mine labor, now this old tradition, not unlike the apprentice, journeyman, master progression of the old guild system of the early American cities, now that changed into the subcontracting system, one no longer controlled by rank and file miners, and that form of social mobility vanished. How would the workers respond? The stage was set for a new sort of trade union, the industrial union. According to the narrative frequently told by labor historians, the industrial union overcomes the limitations of the previous epoch of organization, craft unionism, by organizing all in an industry regardless of skill. This is what the United Mine Workers set out to accomplish, and they did so with great success. First in the vast bituminous fields of the American Midwest, and then with the great anthracite strike of 1902, which Lucia also discussed, here in the anthracite fields, ranks among the most important labor struggles in American history, and for good reason. It marked the first time that a president, in this case Theodore Roosevelt, did not respond to a major labor action with out-and-out repression or by openly taking the side of capital. Instead, Roosevelt sought to negotiate a settlement that could pacify the miners and also ensure company profitability, while also continuing the flow of anthracite. To achieve this end, Roosevelt had to deal with the UMW. The cooperation of the White House, the UMW, as limited as it was, may have predicted the contours of the industrial unionism and the social contract that emerged during and after World War II in the heyday of the Congress of the Industrial Organization and Walter Reuther's famous Treaty of Detroit with General Motors. Bob kind of referred to that. And if our story ended in 1902, this would be a nice and tidy story. However, all was not well in the anthracite industry. Over the next 4 decades, labor turmoil roiled the region, and the UMWA faced serious difficulties in maintaining the workers' allegiance. Our interest here is with this latter phenomenon, for as the UMWA sought to hold the membership, it also worked to defeat a series of rearguard insurgencies. One might have predicted in 1902 that the UMW would join hands with the Morgan interests to rationalize the coal industry. This did not happen. The union avoided major confrontations over subcontracting during the strikes of 1900 and 1902, and during negotiations for decades thereafter under President John L. Lewis. Lewis was the archetypical business unionist. He emphasized wages and benefits, bread and butter issues, but rarely challenged operators' prerogative over organization, and only then under the immense pressure from rank-and-file miners. Partly because of mounting complaints over subcontracting and the UMW's seeming inability to eradicate it, the industrial workers of the world began organizing in the anthracite fields as early as 1906. According to IWW organizer Arturo Calvini, it was, quote, the subcontracting system of the Pennsylvania Coal Company that caused all the unrest. Beginning in 1907 and continuing over the next decades, the Wobblies, as they were also called, stood as the UMWA's major union opponent in hard coal. An anarcho-syndicalist organization, the IWW enjoyed substantial support among immigrant workers, especially in the northern coal field, and particularly around Pittston. The association's militant ideology, along with its rejection of contractual obligations, proved attractive to workers who were chafing under the strain of extreme company policies such as excessive dockage, arbitrary work rules, wage cheating, and the subcontracting system. As our research shows, the Italians, the Sicilians in particular, were among the strongest supporters of the IWW and the most virulent critics of the UMW and the companies. They especially resented the subcontracting system because many had experienced a similar tendency or putting out scheme in the sulfur mines of Sicily, as Bob has uncovered in his research. As a miner writing into the radical newspaper Il Proletario put it, the UMW members of this district are tired of paying for a life of comfort and leisure for a handful of organizers who for 20 years have done nothing for the interests of miners in these parts. They are tired of the subcontract system that confines them to shameful slavery. They are tired of going on strike or not going on strike according to the pleasure and caprice of the officials of the UMW. In unison with the unorganized miners, they are ready for one big union. The IWW was, after leading a significant strike of Italian miners in Pittston, uprooted and defeated by World War I era government repression, the operators, and the UMW. But the grievances that had won its support had not vanished. They continued to nurture insurgencies in the 1920s and in the mine wars of the Great Depression, a subject that Bob will refer to in the paper that follows and that we're dealing with in our upcoming book. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very kindly. Now let's see. Yeah, you're going to take that down. Very good. Yes, the IWW, the Wobblies, a little known and until only recently appreciated chapter in anthracite labor history. They were uncovered by a fellow who did a master's degree at University in Bloomsburg in the 1980s, Patrick Lynch, and he discovered that the IWW was very active in northern anthracite, especially, and they were defeated by a strike in 1916, but they lasted between 07 and 16. It was about 10 years, and a lot of labor unrest, a lot of tumultuous goings on in our coal region. You know, the good version of the Wild East. All right. So thanks again, Tom, for that very, very good presentation. I'm going to speak next, if I can find my presentation. Here we go. Here we go. Well, as Tom alluded, we have a manuscript under review at Penn State University Press called Anthracite Insurgents. It deals with topics that the previous two speakers have mentioned. The United Anthracite Miners of Pennsylvania, which was only around for a few years, as Lucia said, and but they caused quite a storm. Some of them were members, had been members of the IWW, the Wobblies, back in the teens, including Ronaldo Capellini, who we're going to talk about. Our book focuses on the history of this union, but it tells the prehistory, which Tom has just gone through, and Lucia went through. The United Mine Workers of America under John Mitchell, and then John L. Lewis, and the IWW, and there are other big strikes, 1922, 1925, 26. Constant strikes. And dual unions. In other words, competing unions to the main union, which was the UMW or the UMWA. So I'm going to talk about a failed but significant dual union movement, the UAMP, the United Anthracite Miners of Pennsylvania, an anthracite-only union. You see, the UMWA was really dominated by the bituminous miners because there were so many more of them. We have bituminous coal, as Tom's map indicated. We have bituminous coal in 35 states. Alabama has bituminous coal. We know that West Virginia does. So does central and western Pennsylvania. But anthracite, only in these 11 counties of northeastern Pennsylvania, contain the best coal in the world, certainly in this hemisphere. And E.P. Thompson, the British labor historian, stressed in his book in 1963, The Making of the English Working Class, that we should not only focus on big events in big cities, we should look at lesser events, even unsuccessful labor events, in more remote areas, because they can often reveal as much new knowledge as studies of successful unions in better known places. And the IWW, the UAMP, fit this characterization. It's based on our manuscript, which is, there it is, Anthracite Insurgents, Labor Conflict, and Dual Unionism in the Northern Coalfield of Pennsylvania between 1900 and 1935. You've already seen this map. These are the coal fields of northeastern PA. We are focusing on the northernmost field between Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, Luzerne and Lackawanna counties, but even touching up there in Susquehanna County and Forest City. Okay. Whoops. this is the story of anthracite. This is the story. Boom and bust. Boom and bust. And several busts in between. You see this the recessions and the depressions and the strikes. The curve dips and production dips. But the last 30, 40 years, that curve goes down and down and down, even though there's a little blip at the end. And it's still being mined. There are still men underground mining anthracite in the middle coal field, southern coal field, very small, what we often call dog hole mines. Not many workers, a dozen, maybe 20. It's very expensive. It's often shipped to other places for specialty production. But the heyday is 1917. As you can see, 100,000 tons, 1917. World War I, right? There were 5 dual union movements in anthracite between 1907 and 1939. Tom's talked about the IWW. For 2 years, there was a National Miners Union. The NMU, which was a communist-formed union, the Communist Party of the USA, was very active in anthracite. Again, the men were very unhappy with the UMWA, arguing that it's a company union, not doing what it can. That lasted just between 28 and 31, and then left anthracite. June and July of 28, here's the first anthracite miners union, but it was squashed by the companies. But it comes back in 1932 as the UAMP. This is the major rebellion and the topic of our book. However, there's another little effort in 38, 39, the Progressive Miners Union. A small number attempted to do this union. It was a union of the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. Didn't last long. It was also in West Virginia. It was in Ohio. The PMU was around as an alternative. John L. Lewis had to fight these unions, these rebel unions off. But why did he have them? He was a very authoritarian leader, John L. Lewis was. My way or the highway. Very few democratic instincts. He was a dictator. He picked the leaders at the local level. And the men didn't like it. So there's constant labor unrest going back to the 19th century, going back to 1842, the Bates Union strike, the first union in 42, Bates Union, and then several in the 20th century. Even one during World War II, 1943. It's a whole other story. Why all the labor unrest? Well, Tom has alluded to the subcontracting and leasing systems, what I call the tenancy systems. The big companies decided they could make more money leasing and subcontracting their mineral rights to smaller operators, smaller companies. At first, they were subcontractors, unincorporated entrepreneurs. Maybe had 10, 20, 25 workers. They'd get a subcontract for a certain piece of coal, just a few tunnels, let's say. And they'd have to mine that coal and sell it to the big company, say the Pennsylvania Coal Company or the Lehigh Valley Coal Company, who owned the mineral rights. Of course, and then they were under the thumb of Morgan, as mentioned. And then eventually in the 30s, subcontractors stayed around, but leaseholders come in. These are the big guys. This is Pagnotti as an example. Pagnotti Company became the biggest leaseholder in the area. And they were incorporated. They just weren't entrepreneurs. They were corporations. They'd have 1,000, 2,000 workers. They would get mineral rights access to an entire colliery. The Pennsylvania Coal Company, with offices in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre, was a subsidiary of the Erie until Morgan took it over. Erie Railroad. If you've been to Cooper's restaurant in Scranton, that's the Erie Railroad right there. That was their terminal. The leaseholders were bigger guys, and they were often, I shouldn't say often, but they were sometimes controlled by organized criminals. Organized crime laundered their ill-begotten money in two directions, industrially. One was garment making and the other was coal mining. So they'd take gambling money, for example, and they'd buy garment factories, invest in garment equipment, or they'd invest in coal mines, leasing whole collieries, and then finally buying whole collieries. So the big mineral rights controlling companies created the tenancy system. Rather than mine coal, they put it out, so-called put it out, to circumvent the UMWA, to ignore mining laws and mine in places where the coal was thick and rich, like under the Susquehanna River, which led to the Knox mine disaster in 1959, and big profits. Unfortunately, it's capitalism at its worst. So tenancy really is a form of insulating coal operators from the UMWA, from safety, and from the law. You could mine under the Susquehanna in 1959. That was legal. But you had to keep 50 feet of rock over your chambers. The ceiling had to be 50 foot thick. How do you do that? You do boreholes. You drill boreholes in the middle of the river. Well, Knox didn't do that. Northern Coalfield had dozens of them. It wasn't as much of a problem in the middle coalfield and the southern coalfield. But it was very common in the north. Organized crime owned, as I say, some of these leasing companies. Santo Volpe, one of the heads of organized crime in the area, he leased. First he subcontracted, then he leased, then he bought mineral rights and collieries from the Pennsylvania Coal Company. The Pennsylvania Coal Company was the biggest purveyor of subcontracts and leases. The UAMP formed 1932 in UMWA District 1. We were the biggest district of the United Mine Workers Union until the bituminous districts grew. The main leaders was Tom Maloney, mentioned, Ronaldo Capellini, mentioned, and John J. Curran, mentioned. Curran provided moral standing, moral legitimacy. Capellini was a wonderful strategist, and Tom Maloney was a charismatic leader. Their purpose was to make sure the companies abided by the labor contract, the negotiated agreement. The companies didn't do that. They would pay below scale. They would not pay you for yardage. That is the rock that you have to quarry and advancing a chamber. That was in the contract. You get paid for yardage. Okay, and they opposed the subcontractors and the leaseholders. Their critics were the UMWA, the coal companies, the courts, and eventually the Roosevelt administration, because FDR wanted to get on with the recovery from the Depression. And they were striking in northern anthracite, the biggest of the three coal fields. Let me see here. There's Capellini. He was president of UMWA and resigned in 28. He was a radical. He went in as a radical. He was opposed to the coal company when he was elected in 1923. He wanted the workers to have better wages, better conditions, better benefits, more power. So he had a deal with John L. Lewis, who became president of the big union in 1920, as you saw earlier. And he really kind of became Lewis's boy to make peace. So he resigned. But a year later, he goes back to his original radicalism and he becomes the insurgents' leader. And he runs for the district presidency in 1930 and is defeated. He goes to jail in 1931 for setting fire to his own home. He said he was not home when the fire started at the Bloomsburg Fair with his wife, Marie. But the courts were after him. The police was after him. He was a rebel. And this was the coal region. And the coal companies ran the police and the courts for the most part. So he pled guilty. So Marie would escape charges. He was sent to Graterford Penitentiary in Philly for 3.5 years. Marie worked to secure his pardon from Governor Pinchot, a progressive Republican. There were such a species at one time. And Pinchot had got to know Capellini from the strike of 1925 settlement. He's pardoned. Pinchot comes through. However, Marie secures a divorce for reasons that we're not sure. And he goes to her house one night after the divorce, has a battle with her. He's not supposed to see her. According to his parole, it's a parole violation. He goes back to Graterford. One of the main leaders of the UAMP is in jail. Pinchot tried to help. Pinchot sawed the frame up, but too late now. Boylan becomes president of the UMWA in 28, replacing Capellini, appointed by Lewis, had been sending Lewis secret communications about all the unrest. He's a Lewis man from Scranton. Here's Maloney. He's elected president of the UAMP in 32, and he's murdered in April of 36. More about that. Wilkes-Barre Township boy. Bombs were mailed, as Lucia said, on April 9th and 10th. Maloney's murdered. His son Tom Jr.'s murdered. Michael Gallagher's murdered. The caretaker at St. Mary's Cemetery, an employee really of Monsignor Curran. And Margaret Maloney is blinded in one eye when the bombs explode in their kitchen in Wilkes-Barre Township. Good Friday morning. Tom opens the package, kaboom. 6 packages were sent. There's Tom Jr. There's Margaret. She gave me 2 oral histories. Died about 10 years ago, but vivid memory. This is 16 when she was 16. Time magazine writes about the Easter presents, the 6 bomb packages. It says here in the 3rd paragraph, it was a dynamiting case. A dynamiting case which grew out of a fight between the UAMP and the UMWA. Other boxes were sent to Judge Benjamin Jones, who had locked up a whole 28 of UAMPers. Luther Niffen, the sheriff, who was not a friend of the UMW of the UAMP. Harry Goldstone, superintendent at the Buttonwood, he did not like the UAMP. So, and James Gorman, who was the Anthracite umpire to negotiate cases, he got a bomb. But the others were either defective or intercepted. There's what they looked like. That's what the cigar boxes looked like. This one was intercepted by the U.S. Post Office. Michael Fugelman was indicted for the murder. He was a good friend of Tom Maloney. He was a German immigrant. Denied it completely. I've done several oral histories about him. Everyone says he was innocent. He couldn't have done it. There's the Buttonwood where Maloney worked, Fugelman worked, and several other men involved in the investigation worked, owned by the Glen Alden Coal Company. This is what the package bombs looked like. Sorry. What they looked like wrapped in brown paper with this handwriting, and they made Fugelman give handwriting when he was in custody. There were 2 handwriting experts at his trial who said that's not his handwriting. But the prosecution had 2 handwriting experts who said that it was his handwriting. The jury believed the prosecution. Couldn't have done it. They were together every day, Maloney and Fugelman. Couldn't have done it. They were both UAMP members, and Fugelman was on the executive board. Fugelman appealed to the state Supreme Court, would not listen to it. He was convicted on circumstantial evidence. Prosecution never had a motive, but it was all circumstantial. They found bomb-making materials in his basement, for example. So he appealed, and it was over. District Attorney Leon Schwartz of Luzerne County spun a web of guilt based upon 20 threads of circumstantial evidence. New York Times advertises it. There are the 6 bombs. Now, there was a fire the same day at St. Mary's Rectory in Wilkes-Barre. Same day as the bombing, same day as Maloney's murder. Big fire. The first floor was severely damaged. Priests live on the second floor, no damage. The investigators ruled that day, they investigated and said there's no link to the 6 package bombs. They said it began in a wastebasket. Well, how did it begin in the wastebasket? They did not address. I've interviewed Agnes Cupsis, the secretary, said she heard an explosion before the fire occurred. Monsignor Curran was perplexed about the case. Okay? But Curran gets a heart attack that day. He knew Tom Maloney, best friends, and Michael Gallagher. He'd been going to Washington. He was quite exhausted. He remained skeptical about the cause of the fire, never recovered from the fire or the assassinations. He dies 6 months later. There he is in his office with a photo of his buddy, Roosevelt, of Teddy Roosevelt. And as Lucia mentioned, Roosevelt includes him in his autobiography. And there's John L. Lewis, Tom Kennedy, standing officer in the UMWA and elected lieutenant governor of Pennsylvania in the 30s, with Curran and his toupee. Who murdered Maloney? We were not able to find out. We'll continue researching, but I know 2 people who were really into it. Professor from Bloomsburg and a school teacher from Wilkes-Barre. They were called off the case. Dan Flood, our representative from Luzerne County, told the one teacher in Wilkes-Barre who was doing it for her master's degree at the U in Scranton, don't touch this. But the main point here is that a lot of labor activism in anthracite, the Wild East, decades of strikes and violence and murders and beatings and firings. It was a tough place to work. Thank you very much. Okay. We'll move right on. We're running a little bit late, but no extra charge. We have our next speaker, who's Bob Schmidt, who has been researching anthracite for, I don't know, probably a decade. Bob's been more than a decade for his doctoral degree at Binghamton University. And Bob has done a whole lot of work, more than anybody else, on the history of violence in anthracite, including bombings. And he's done some real path-breaking work with statistics and with arguments about what's behind the bombing. Okay, so without further ado, here is a Robert Schmidt, who's going to talk about the history of bombing in northeastern PA and the ins and outs of it. Thanks a lot, Bob.
So we'll see if we can get this on the first try.
And I see we have a visitor from across the pond. I see where Richard Healy has joined the broadcast. Welcome, Richard, from Portsmouth, England.
Let me just, Bob, do you see the
yeah, title slide? Okay. Title slide.
All right, so we should be just all right.
I think just hitting it.
I hope so. Yep. Yep.
Perfect.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
okay.
but we can't see you, Bob. Would you? Okay, okay, now we can. Now we can. Okay.
Okay. Okay, so my project titled, at least for this purposes of this talk, Radical Means, Conservative Ends, making sense of dynamite bombings in northeastern Pennsylvania. And I'm beginning with a contradiction of radical and conservatism, and we're going to see, or I'm going to hope to demonstrate how that contradiction unfolds. Pictured here is in the backdrop, going from left to right. That's the Sterling Market. This was bombed in 1929. This is on the 800 block of Dixon City. If you're from the Scranton area, you've driven by this site. It's leveled now. In full disclosure, this was actually a Black Hand bomb, organized crime bombing, not so much related to industrial violence, which I'm going to be talking about. But I did want to give some sort of indication of the destructive quality and character of dynamite. So dynamite has a dual character. It was both celebrated and feared. It was at once a forerunner of progress. So in the upper left-hand corner, Explosives Engineers, a periodical. This comes out in 1933, talking about the sort of productive aspects of dynamite bombing. In 1933 is the peak of an industrial conflict in dynamite and porch bombings in Scranton. And this contrasts with the fear of dynamite bombings. It was heralded by anarchists and it was feared by conservative reactionary contemporaries because it was thought to be this great equalizer that would democratize violence, empower the working class, and embolden the class struggle. But it was simultaneously, and probably more so, a terrible externality in terms of accidental death and just in terms of the victimhood of dynamite bombings. The working class bore the brunt of it. And I'm going to argue that dynamite bombings are important to understand because it's a new prism to look at the sort of fissures and fault lines of class struggle and class conflict in the industrial era. When dynamite appears in American labor history and in industrial history, the typical knee-jerk reaction is to think anarchism. It's to think something radical. It's to think of a foreign ideology, something imported from somewhere else. What I'm going to be arguing today is that particularly in northeastern Pennsylvania, but this is true nationally, most of the perpetrators, in fact, nearly all of the perpetrators, were not radicals, were not influenced by some foreign ideology. They were conservative trade unionists. I want to look at three important features of northeastern Pennsylvania to explain why this region was so conducive to bombings. The first was supply. And northeastern Pennsylvania was saturated with explosives. Anthracite, as the presenters explained before, is hard coal, and it's harder than bituminous. So it consumes much more explosive power to mine. And in 1913 alone, the region consumed about 16 million pounds of dynamite. And for that reason, DuPont and other explosive manufacturers set up shops here in northeastern Pennsylvania. Of Pennsylvania's 39 explosive manufacturers, 15 of them were in northeastern Pennsylvania. In fact, we have communities named after these firms, Wapwallop and DuPont. On top of that, after World War I, the federal government, through its war surplus explosives program, flooded the country with millions of pounds of cheap military-grade dynamite. And most of that was used for farming. And I bring that up because I just want to sort of demonstrate how common dynamite was and how easily accessible it was. Number two is skill. Availability alone doesn't explain a whole lot if you don't have the competence to use it. And the folks in northeastern Pennsylvania had that competence. Handling explosives required a specific literacy. You need to know how to cap, how to tamp, and how to time a fuse. In the anthracite fields, this was common knowledge. Frank Nealis, a writer for the Scranton Republican, captured this perfectly, to my mind, in 1929. He wrote that in Scranton, the percentage of the population that understood high explosives was about the same pro rata basis as automobile drivers. He went on to say, every other man in this section understands fuses, squibs, and the manner of control. In this region, the bomb wasn't a mysterious device requiring a terrorist mastermind. It was an ordinary facet of everyday life. And the third feature is culture. Dynamite marked rituals. Children as well as adults would use it, set it off during 4th of July celebrations. It was used for all sorts of practical problems in farming, taking out old foundations, for example. Dynamite was often introduced to settle church quarrels. It was used in bank robberies, suicide, and even to settle romantic grievances. Dynamite had an ordinary character. This is not exceptional. This was mundane. This was everyday. And if we treat bombings as prima facie evidence of imported radicalism, we miss the reality. Dynamite was already embedded in everyday life, sitting on the shelf, waiting for an actor with a grievance. For the remainder of the presentation, I want to look at sort of the temporal aspect of bombings in the region as well as the geographical. And they do move together, but for the purposes of just sort of introducing some ideas, I'm going to sort of separate them and then put them together. If you were to go to newspapers.com, and you could do this in many different ways, and do a search for dynamite or dynamiting and strike, and of course you'd have to take out McNamara because the McNamara bomb, there's just so much written on it, there's just so many hits. If you were to take that out, this is what the chart would look like. And the temporal aspect of this, to my mind, is fascinating because when I first started researching this, And if I were a betting man, I would say, well, dynamitings would probably have started in the 1870s with the so-called Molly Maguires. I would have said, well, okay, if they don't start then, it would have started in the 1880s with Haymarket. That's not what happened. Dynamitings don't actually start until after the turn of the century, and they don't reach their peak until after 1920. This does not track with anarchism. It doesn't track with the IWW. In fact, the historical record will show the so-called radicals, and they're not exactly a uniform lot. There's many differences among them. The so-called radicals were targets of violence in this period, not the perpetrators of violence. So I'm trying to sort of solve this mystery. And of course, you can see the peak in the 1930s, which tracks with the rival unionism in Scranton in the Wilkes-Barre area. When is the first dynamiting? Or what are some of the earliest cases of dynamiting? And I'm of the mind that when something happens, partly explains why it happens. The earliest bombings happen, this is one of the earliest that I found, in 1900, in the Hazleton area. What just happened there a couple years before? The Latimer Massacre. And I'm anticipating an argument I'm going to make, but as it becomes less and less safe for workers to go into a crowd, they're being shot, they're being beaten by the police, they start moving towards dynamiting. This here is a GIS map of dynamitings in Scranton from 1925 to about 1936. And the red dots there indicate the instances of dynamite. What I'm looking to explain and present to you is why it is after 1920, what happened after 1920, that explains such a surge in dynamite. Now, as I said before, they happen after the turn of the century, but the anthracite industry goes into a period of relative labor peace through the 1910s. Of course, there are some strikes, but broadly speaking, from about 1902 to about 1922, it's a period of relative labor peace. But then something happens after 1922. And I'm going to unpack these four ideas. Industrial decline in the Great Depression, changes in policing and labor jurisprudence, union centralization, and the main culprit, to my mind, pure and simple unionism. This here is the chart of the anthracite output over the course of the anthracite era. And the Great Depression, we should note, started earlier here in northeastern Pennsylvania than it did nationally. And so, put simply, after World War I, coal is being replaced by other fuel sources and output declines. As output declines, demand for labor contracts, and you're seeing sort of higher unemployment rates, especially during the Depression. So that's an aggravating factor. People are working less. And another important issue during this period is that, especially during the Depression, was that labor is inert. It can't just pick up and move because their prospects of employment elsewhere aren't greater. So this is sort of setting the stage. Number two, after 1902, the coal and iron police and the National Guardsmen are being replaced by the American Cossacks, the Pennsylvania State Police, which is a strike-breaking institution. They're not there to protect and serve. Well, they're there to protect and serve property. They're not there to protect and serve the public as we understand police today. And they're much different than the coal and iron police. They're professionalized. They're able to dispatch to a scene much quicker. And they're preemptive and they're provocative. They're trying to get to crowds before they form. This isn't their training. They're trying to break up crowds before they form. And many of them, it should be noted, that they're veterans of the Spanish-American War, and they're used to sort of dealing with rebellions. Here's a picture of the Scranton police departments, because local police departments by the 1930s are forming their own riot squads that are getting to the crowds and beating the crowds. here's sort of, I had ChatGPT help me with this, a timeline of what sort of is leading to dynamite bombings. A strike will happen, a picket will form, there'll be altercations. The state police will intervene, in many cases preempting conflicts among workers. And then as the crowd is broken up, as the crowd is dispersed, as it's very difficult for workers to have a redress of grievances, they're turning to the bomb because they don't have the institutional vehicles to have their grievances redressed. Another aspect of it is union centralization. Now, much of this was already talked about, but one important issue, especially in the Scranton and Wilkes-Barre region, was the fact that Lewis absolutely refused to consider work equalization. Lewis at this time is more interested in the survival of anthracite. He's more preoccupied with the efficiency and output of in the survival of the anthracite industry itself, and he's against equalization. Mine operations are closing their least productive sites or least profitable sites, and he's not fighting that because he wants to see the union survive, and he wants to see the industry survive. Second, and this was also touched on, but I'll just mention it briefly, the United Mine Workers becomes autocratic. So he's picking union leaders rather than having conventions and electing your own union leadership. He's coming in as an autocrat. And this is happening in an interesting time because at this time in the 1930s, he's a national hero. He's praised, and some of the scholarship is sort of praising him, but here he's a local autocrat. Last, but certainly not least, is union ideology, which is called pure and simple unionism, or bread and butter unionism. To understand why dynamite became the primary language of conflict, we have to recognize that miners were trapped in pure and simple unionism. The pure and simple unionism of the United Mine Workers narrowed the horizons of legitimate protest. It confined workers' struggle to immediate economic gains at the point of production. By rejecting political avenues, by rejecting broad social visions like the Knights of Labor have and other unions have had, and insisting that the shop floor was the only legitimate terrain of struggle, pure and simple unionism left workers to stake everything on direct confrontation with employers. This ideology narrowed rather than expanded the repertoire of possible action at the very moment when the state was criminalizing the crowd. Injunctions were dissolving picket lines and professionalized riot police were beating workers. In this context, the job-conscious trade union was doubly trapped, committed to fighting only where the employer was strongest, yet stripped of the collective tactics, mass pickets, boycotts, solidarity actions that had once made fights winnable. The result, as Eugene Debs famously observed of the Mackaman bombing, was that dynamite plots carried out the policy of Gomper's craft unionism to its logical conclusion. Dynamite required no mass assembly, no picket line, no public square, only skill, resolve, and the willingness to escalate. In summation, anthracite workers acted within this ideology's narrow framework. They sought not revolution, but leverage, not a new social order, but a restoration of a livable one. As Eugene Debs argued, dynamite was not a departure from conservative unionism, but an agreed extension of it. I'll be brief here, but I do want to look at sort of the shifting geography of dynamite conflict in northeastern Pennsylvania. So we talked about the temporal aspect of it. I'd like to shift to the geography of it. Dynamite bombings are not everywhere and all the time the same. They have a history and it moves. For the period that I'm talking about after the 1920s, they begin in Pittston. They move as rival unionism is spreading in Scranton and Wilkes-Barre in the 1930s. And then it moves again to the southern field among bootleggers. The police are dynamiting bootleg holes. The bootleggers are dynamiting the shovels in the police vehicles of the police that are trying to close the holes. Here's a picture of bombing of the Pennsylvania Hillside Coal Company. This was a power plant in the Pittston area. Bob spoke about this before. They're looking to fight the subcontracting system, the infiltration of organized crime. This is mine President Boylan's home was dynamited. He's the president handpicked of District 1. This is over in Lower Greenridge, I think at Boulevard Avenue, in fact. In the southern field here, as I mentioned before, the independent miners, they're seeing their holes being blown up by the Pennsylvania State Police. They're in turn fighting back against the police. The conflict takes a different shape here. It's not civil war like it is in Scranton-Wilkes-Barre. It's not worker versus worker. The southern field is sort of united behind bootlegging and enjoy community support. I'll just mention this briefly. If you've read Tom Dublin's book, The Face of Decline, he has a large section about this, about equalization in the Panther Valley. As I said before, industrial violence in northeastern Pennsylvania wasn't everywhere and all the time the same. It wasn't just wholesale violent. There were places where it wasn't violent, and we need to explain why. Equalization worked in places like Tamaqua. You had one firm, it was, the union reluctantly but successfully took up the cause, and work was spread among the workers during the Depression. Why did dynamite bombings end? A couple reasons. Number one, the onset of World War II. You have full employment and you have worker mobility. So agitated worker, where there is no exit, there's voice, but where there's exit, people move, and they move to greener pastures. Number two, there's institutional consolidation in the New Deal. Now it becomes law that unions must be recognized, and there must be an institutional sort of vehicle to redress grievances. Three, laws and regulations to control dynamite. Four, exhaustion and trauma, and Bob spoke on this about the Maloney assassination. Community essentially is getting sick of the dynamitings. A couple of concluding remarks to share with you and to sort of wrap up. If we look at only the means, bombings, sabotage, you might call these communities radical or foreign, infected by outside ideology. But if we take a historical view, we see that dynamite bombings were a call to share work, stop the cheating, install democracy in electing union officials, and to let the town survive. Those are the most conservative ends, rooted in family, neighborhood, democracy, that promised working people a say in the conditions of their own survival, in an American ideology that promised a standard of living consistent with the work that they were willing to put in for it. Dynamite bombings were the death knell of an industrial democracy. Operators pursued efficiency without responsibility. The United Mine Workers sacrificed local democracy for institutional peace. The law honored contracts more faithfully than communities. In that setting, collective bargaining by dynamite was not a revolution. It was a petition blown into the night, the only petition some miners believed would be read.
Very good, Bob. Excellent. Excellent presentation. The nuances of bombing, the regionalization of bombing, all important, all very, very, very important subjects. So thank you very much, Bob. Bob's got cutting edge work on that aspect of the region's history, which is very real and very important. Bodie, would you mind taking over the questions and answers? Because of course, I can't see the audience. And then we have Zoomers here. Perhaps some Zoomers have questions. So please take it away, Bodie.
All right. Well, thanks, Bob. Thanks to our speakers. It was a really great presentation today. And then just a reminder, Jeff and Kathleen from the Anthracite Heritage Museum and Iron Furnace Associates have some refreshments and snacks in the back for us. So that's Jeff and Kathleen right there. So thanks, guys. So if there are questions online, send them in the chat, and I will try and keep an eye on that. But as far as the audience here, let me see. Do we have questions for our speakers? I don't know if anybody wants to come up and.
I can start with
Okay, Chester.
I had a question about the dynamite. I think about the powder that the miners had to buy at the company store. Were they making their own sticks of dynamite from that powder, or how did that work? With the, I guess there were these kegs of powder because they would manufacture this in DuPont and in other areas.
And Chester is asking about the manufacturing of dynamite.
Bodie, do you have a portable microphone?
No. Let me see. I've got this microphone. If anybody wants, it should be directional. So if you want to come up and speak into the microphone.
Because we Zoomers can't hear the questions.
Yeah.
Well. We can't hear. We can't hear. We can't hear a thing. Hello.
Hello?
Now we got it. Now we got it.
Okay. Were you done with your answer? So I think you've got another question. Looks like Johnny Johnson had a question. Oh, Bob answered it. But the German guy who had the death penalty in 1936, was there any accused tie-ins or relations to National Socialism?
Sorry, I answered that, Bodie. I didn't mean to. Sorry. But no, he was, Mr. Fugman was not tied to National Socialism of the era. He was a mine worker in Germany. He served in the German army in World War I, which he deserted from toward the end of the war. Goes to Canada, then comes to Wilkes-Barre, and works in the mines. But he was a foreigner. He had a German accent. He had a interesting disposition. Wore a bow tie. He bowed before he entered the courtroom, and he bowed as he left the courtroom. And again, everyone I interviewed said he could not have done it because he and Maloney were best friends. He would drive Maloney around to rallies and whatnot. He was on the executive board of the UAMP. No motive, but they found this evidence in his basement when they ransacked his basement, the state police. People thought that the evidence might have been planted. Look, they arrested him on July 2nd, 1936. The bombings happened on April 10th. So you go through April, you go through May, you go through June, no arrests. The public's getting very angry about this. There are editorials severely criticizing the authorities. You guys can't find out who did this. And then suddenly it's Fugman. And there's a lot of parallels between Fugman and Hauptmann. Hauptmann, who earlier had been convicted and sent to death for kidnapping the child of the aviator Lindbergh. Thank you. Yeah, in fact, the same the same four handwriting experts testified at both trials. And in both cases, two of them said it couldn't have been Hauptmann or Fugelman, and the other two said, the other trial said, yes, they were. So there are a lot of parallels. And by the way, the FBI is involved at this point. J. Edgar Hoover, with the fingerprints, he's creating a scientific FBI with Hauptmann and with Fugelman, and the jury of his peers in Luzerne County Courthouse found the prosecution's arguments convincing. They could have recommended prison and life, but they recommended the death penalty.
Okay, another question?
I'm wondering if anybody would want to comment on possible corollary to anthracite labor difficulties and what might occur when AI replaces many workers.
So the question is asking for corollaries to in the anthracite labor history to current trends in AI with worker replacement.
Does Tom want to handle that?
Yeah, I can just be thinking out loud a little bit, but one thing about anthracite coal mining is that it was actually pretty resistant to technological change for a long time. But I think in other industries where that took place, there was always a contradictory effect to that. So the big application, the huge transformation that came with the assembly line in industrial production, it weakened certain kinds of labor. For example, in the meatpacking industry, the skilled butcher was eliminated, and with it, the craft unions that represented guys who really knew how to take apart an animal and turn it into meat. But at the same time, it concentrated a lot of workers in industries like meatpacking on shop floors and auto plants, and so I think that it's going to probably, we can't look into the future, but it'll have similar effects where it will displace labor, and what Lucia said about, it's going to make a lot of people a lot wealthier, but all of their stocks represent claims on value that in the end have to be taken from workplaces across the country and across the world, and it'll probably therefore also give new power to new kinds of opposition. But yeah, very, very good question. Very hard to know, but it's really good to look at history and to think about questions like that. History doesn't provide answer machine, but it does maybe shine a little light on some problems.
Say this for me because I don't want to go up, but I saw somebody speaking the other day, a politician in Washington, I think it was a senator, a Democrat, saying there's no preparation being made in Washington for the elimination of all of these jobs as of now. Yeah. And we have to start thinking that way. So
yeah,
say that.
Lucia just pointed out from the floor and asked me to report to those on Zoom that some politician in Washington, a senator, just acknowledged that there's actually no preparation for the displacement that's coming. I don't know if it's still coming, but they were going to build a data center here somewhere. Where those data centers are coming, I just saw one is going to go to northeastern Ohio, which is in some ways like our region, old industrial area. It's going to cost $140 million. It's going to bring 10 full-time jobs. So, it's going to cause everybody's electrical bill to go up. Anyway.
I wonder too, though, if right now, though, if there isn't really any advocate for those workers whose jobs are going to be eliminated. The union had its peaks and valleys as far as influence, but now who's going to fight for those people that are?
That's what I think we need. Yeah. We need a rethinking of all that.
Yeah. Another question?
Yeah, with regard to the short-lived nature of the dual unions, whether it was the IWW or the Communist Union, is there a pattern or a reason that they were also short-lived in contrast to the UMWA?
So the question is, looking at the dual union movement, was there a pattern to the reason why they were such short-lived?
Yeah, they seem to be acknowledging serious grievances with a strong law.
Yeah, as they were expressing strong grievances, but weren't able to really affect much change.
Yeah,
So,
I can address that. Perhaps Tom has something to say about it. But the odds were certainly stacked against you. I mean, any radical movement is going to have odds stacked against it, especially in a conservative country like the United States. Again, reform is preferred to revolution. And the power of the state, the power of the police, and Bob Schmidt might agree that, the state really controls the forms of violence. We saw the armed police in Scranton. That was a wonderful image of the armed police in Scranton. And that's what these rebel unions were up against. The IWW fought for a long time. I mean, 1907 to 1916. I went through a series of strikes, and they were very committed. But the courts, the police, the federal government deported a whole lot of wobblies. There were purges of wobblies. I mean, throughout the country, the wobblies were out west. They were up here. They were in Philadelphia. They were all over the place. The wobblies. They were really, really committed individuals, mainly immigrants. They were in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, usually among, again, different ethnic groups. But no matter where you went, the federal government was there, and the agents of repression were there. Really beginning soon, the FBI and the Palmer raids. We know what the Palmer raids were, right, of the 20s. The federal government under Secretary Palmer bringing down violence and mayhem against wobblies and other people. Now there were the wobblies did bring some of it on. There was the Wall Street bombing of the 1920s, the shattered parts of Wall Street. Terrorists, they were terrorists, some of the wobblies. So the power of the state, I think, is the reason, and the use of violence would be my answer. Tom?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said, Bob, and I'll just add a couple points. One thing about the IWW was that it was kind of neither a fish nor fowl. It was kind of like a radical political party and a union, but because they didn't accept contracts, they didn't believe in contracts, they didn't have any kind of bureaucracy. So there wasn't an institution. They'd lead workers on strike, and then they would sort of dissolve. They had phenomenal figures, and I just want to mention one, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who's Irish, and there's a new book out on her by a scholar named Marianne Trashadi, and her parents came from Pittston Trashadis. They were coal miners with the same background as Capolini. But the other thing is, you had the quote, Bob, on E.P. Thompson and looking at labor movements that fail. Some of them won. And so, for example, the biggest unions of the Great Depression began as dual unions. The UAW, there was a fight over whether the AFL or the CIO would control it. And they really had to drive the AFL out of the plants in Detroit and Flint. the United Steel Workers. In fact, the whole CIO, which now it's the AFL-CIO, was born as a dual union movement against the AFL. The irony there for our region is that the CIO came out of the United Mine Workers, but here the United Mine Workers was in the business of crushing the dual unions. So that's a little bit of an irony, but otherwise I agree with everything that Bob said.
The CIO being the Congress of Industrial Organizations, founded in the 30s by none other than John L. Lewis, who splintered off from the American Federation of Labor. Then in the 50s, the AFL joined with the CIO. And the AFL wanted to organize craft unions, carpenters, and so forth. But the CIO organized steel workers and mine workers who were not necessarily craftsmen, although the coal miners did see themselves as craftsmen. Especially
there's another question.
Certified miners.
It's not exactly a question, but a comment about food money. It is handwriting. German handwriting is very different from American handwriting, and Germans hardly ever learned the new way to write. Especially if you look at his signature, you have the U and a little mark on top of it. That's not how Americans write a U in the name. So it is really, it calls into question about who had what motive, in deciding which was the signature.
It wasn't a question, it was a comment on German handwriting and the fact that Germans didn't learn the new way of writing in the United States, and that it's not surprising maybe that they were unable to link the handwriting. Is that?
Somebody was ignorant of the way he wrote.
Yes, somebody was ignorant of the way he wrote.
Yeah.
Okay, is there another question? Oh.
I don't, maybe you can't answer this, but when did, it was something with what you asked, black powder was the original explosive that was used to mine coal. When did dynamite overtake it? Because dynamite wasn't invented till that's in the late 60s.
1866.
Yeah, the question is about when dynamite was invented and overtook black powder.
Railroad, blasting tunnels, as well as for mining. Certainly by 1880.
So by 1880.
And so that's what I find fascinating, because
they
have access to it, but they don't weaponize it until after 1900.
Okay, Beth.
Just related to the dynamite bombings, there were hundreds of bombings. Were these people ever caught and tried and put to jail for their bombings? Who was bombing?
The question is
how were they perceived?
It's about the number of bombings and how many people were actually caught and convicted.
Can Bob come to the front and answer that? It's an important
question. Can you hear me?
Important question.
Bob, can you hear me? Okay. So the answer, put simply, it changes over time. The major complaint was that people were doing it and getting away with it. The FBI actually develops some of their investigative tools in response to blackhanders. So a lot of forensic type evidence and evidence the FBI development is actually chasing dynamite bombers. It's really not until the 20s and 30s that they're caught, but most of them are getting away with it, number one. Number two, the punishment was nominal. A couple years in jail. But so too was the damage. Most dynamite bombings were not like you would see of like the LA Times, for example, or the Haymarket, or the Wall Street bombing. Most bombings, it was a couple $1,000s worth of damage. The porch, part of your house, for example.
They were mostly crimes against property then.
Crimes against property, yeah.
So trying to kill, assassinate.
Yeah, generally speaking. I mean,
There were
hundreds of them, yeah. And this is across, and it's not just northeastern Pennsylvania. This is across industrial America. It's across Pennsylvania for sure.
Hundreds in northeastern.
Hundreds in northeastern Pennsylvania. Yeah. But put simply, most of them are getting away with it. Some people are getting caught, and it's more or less a slap on the wrist because there's not a whole lot of damage, and there's not a whole. It takes a while for laws to be developed, against this type of thing.
I can add to that the anthracite insurgents had a lot of bombings, a whole lot of bombings. And the newspapers, the Scranton Times, editorialized against the police, criticizing them. Why can't you catch the bombers? They were too elusive. But finally, toward the 1934 and 35, they were being more caught. And they were given, just like 6 guys were charged with being a part of the bombing in Nanticoke. And they were given 6 years. They were given six years. And some of the guys said, well, listen, I was just there during the discussion and so forth. I didn't actually set the fuse. Didn't matter. It didn't matter. It was really getting bad by 1935. And then, of course, in 36, we have the Good Friday, so-called Good Friday bombings, Maloney's, Gallagher, and then the ones that didn't hit their mark.
Well, great. Anything else?
So in the end, who killed more miners, the mine owners or the dynamite bombers?
So the question is, who killed more miners?
Dynamite accidents.
Dynamite accidents, dynamite, or the mine owners themselves? It was a facetious question.
Okay, but there's really no contest because 35,000 miners died in northeastern PA between 1850 and roughly 1950. 35,000, mainly from roof falls, explosions, cavings. Okay, and so that's and not even counting those who were injured. Many more than 35,000 were injured, and many more had asthma and were in effect injured. So it's really the structure and the nature of the industry itself, the systematic methods of mining. The U.S. had the highest mining death rates in the world per ton mined between 1850 and 1950. Other countries had far safer mines. Why? They have more government regulation, and you know how the U.S. feels about government regulation.
Well, great. Well, Bob, I'm going to try and give you a look at the audience. We had about 35 people here today. I don't know if you can see. And we had about 15 online. So you got to look. So good audience. Thanks for coming out, everybody. And don't forget to grab some. Oh.
Just thank you. That's all. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. So don't forget to grab something in the back of the room. And if you want to renew your membership to the museum or take out a new one, see Jeff and Kathleen in the back there. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for coming out.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks, panelists.
Yeah, sure. Not on me, but you can write if you have to follow. You can write to both of us.
Hey, Sally.
Yeah, no problem.